We are now theoretically about to be live, and there is the RJ's Evolution Hour logo, of which we don't get to see Patreon thing underneath that. Well, so much for that idea. I'm going to have to get this a little bit better in future. This is Evolution Hour 14. RJ Downard, a very new kid on the block, trying to figure out how to do all of this fancy schmancy video YouTubing thing and looking like a dumb klutz every single time. I have some guests. We have the marvelous Jackson and the newcomer to the block, who is, introduce yourself there.
I'm Trill. I mean, if you guys know the great debate community, you probably know me by now. Enough said. Move on. Okay.
Anyway, this is actually a riff off of a previous great debate community discussion, which involved a big knockdown drag-out with Aaron Ra from a group of people who were presenting Fodor's argument. You have an interruption there?
Sorry.
Okay. Where Jerry Fodor's argument criticizing natural selection as a tautology, that it couldn't be verified, it couldn't be tested, it couldn't be refuted, and he offered some very peculiar generic examples which the person defending this essentially repeated about heart cells and things going thump thump and all that, which was kind of vague. I kept on screaming at the chat window about aphids, 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 as a perfectly fine example of where natural selection is able to testably verify why things are going on the way they do. So I thought about where everybody was going astray and why Aaron Ra wasn't exactly jumping on the issues because they were a little bit too generic, and I kindly boiled it down to a series of simple concepts. First of all, natural selection is saying is that if you've got a trait that's really useful, that's going to improve your chances of reproductive survival, that the thing should be spreading in the population by natural selection. If it isn't, then there must be some downside to it. That leads to a natural prediction, if that. So theoretically, it could fail. If you could find an example of a positive trait that just is not spreading in the population, even though it's inheritable, that would be a direct violation of natural selection principles. In reverse, you could say that if something is actually a deleterious mutation that's not good for you, it should be weeded out of the system by natural selection. And if it isn't, then that leads also to a refutation, or it leads you to do further research. We have a person has just joined, Realistic Nihilist has joined the video. We'll introduce you in just a moment. I was just on a riff here explaining the basic concepts of where natural selection is testable and falsifiable or not. So you've got basically two prongs of positive and negative. You have drift in the middle where it would be sustained independent of that. There's a whole mathematical, technical literature explaining why alleles are preserved at the rates they are and blah, blah, blah. Harvey Weinberg and I guess a lot of these other things. And Jackson at some point could probably weigh in on the little fiddly bit details there. But
whoa.
In general, yeah, we'll get back to you on that one too. Anyway, the main point is that if you have something that's really, it looks like it's violating the natural selection principle, if natural selection is really true, you're going to find there's a backstory that explains why it's going on, and you can empirically determine that and predict it. So what happens in the case of aphids and sexuality is that asexuality is more efficient than sexuality. There's a cost to be paid dynamically for all of this getting together and gene crossing and all that. But the literature over the past 20 or 30 years is pretty well established that sexuality has a plus side, a really big plus side. It can evolve way faster than parasites can. So if you want to keep one step or two steps ahead of your potentially deadly parasites, sexual reproduction is a really good way to do it. So that means, how do asexual organisms pull this little trick off? Well, aphids have become a really interesting test case because it turns out that there are other mechanisms in play to insulate them from their parasites, and that's why they can go into an asexual mode. And you can even look at groups of aphids where one of them is asexual and the other one isn't, and the kinds of endosymbionts that are protecting the asexual ones aren't in play for the sexual ones. So you can predict this out, and you can work it out in very, very great detail, and verifying that natural selection is still operating in nature. The classic example of a negative mutation that is sustained in the population is sickle-cell anemia. That if you look at sickle cell, it's not good for you. If you have both of the haplotypes from your parents, you're going to end up with anemia, and it's not good. How come then in at least 3 different population groups this has popped up? While it turns out it protects you from malaria. The Plasmodium falciparum parasite just starves if you have a little bit, one of the alleles, as this sickle cell mode. It doesn't prevent you from functioning, but it means that the downsides of the sickle cell is way less than the downsides of your malaria, and that's why it's sustained in the population. That's referred to as the scorched earth defense. And there are several others. I think cystic fibrosis and a few other things are ones that are implicated as scorched earth defenses that actually are sustained in the population because they protect you against something else. And I'd have to look up the technical literature on that, but I didn't have the time to do a follow-through on that. Aaron Ra, in his response, did bring up peppered moths. And that was a legitimate issue as well, because the peppered moth is a classic example of a case where you had the light-colored moths with a natural form, and then pollution darkened up the trees with soot, and the population changed, and you found the dark ones beginning to be more prominent. And then when they cleaned up the pollution, the light ones came back. This became a cause célèbre ago when Michael Majerus had written a book where inadvertently he gave the impression that this was kind of mythical, that there were problems with the kettle oil experiment that had been done in the 50s on this. And Jerry Coyne actually helped fuel the on that one by misreading Majerus, and that got riffed on by Jonathan Wells and the intelligent design crowd, and suddenly the peppered moth was controversial, and it pissed Majerus off enormously. And he actually undertook a huge replication experiment where they corrected the methodological lapses in kettle oil and reproduced it and confirmed that in fact kettle oil was quite right, and that the peppered moth was a perfectly legitimate example of that. And the intelligent designers have tended to kind of shy away from accepting that. They've still been playing the old hands on that. So what you've got then in general is that there is evidence for positive selection, there's evidence for negative selection, it is experimental, it is verifiable, it is predictable. There's a huge literature on all of this stuff at the bargain basement end. So how come Fodor didn't know about it? Well, I read his damn book. And he's just basically refighting the battles that Gould and Eldridge had back with Dawkins and Maynard Smith and all that over in Britain in the 1980s, I guess when they were forming their views on what evolution was, 70s and 80s. And it's just, and the fact that Fodor was offering only generic examples of things and seemed reluctant to offer technical citations and to get into actual data stream indicates why this hasn't exactly been all that impressive from the regular scientific point of view. It was also a weirdly ahistorical argument, because in effect the fellow that was asking about, well, how do you falsify natural selection? Well, it's the same question as asking, how do you falsify gravity? Relativity theory. Well, first of all, you have to show that all the evidence for it is wrong, and if you don't do that, you're in trouble. And because gravity and relativity theory work predictively and effectively, that in order to falsify it, you have to get rid of that whole track record. But it sounded like Fodor and the ones that are pushing this argument are operating at a onesies thing, that you only have to take that particular example and you don't get to pay attention to the historical trajectory of all the other work that's been done to establish it. And boy, that's not how science runs. So in every respect, this was just a weirdly annoying argument. And Aaron Ra, who has a little bit of a flashpoint temper to begin with, wasn't quite up, in my view, to responding to it effectively. And I'm trying to do a little better at my end. So unleash your commentary there, O ye of the followers on the video.
You go ahead, Thaddeus.
Yeah, wasn't Aaron Ross supposed to be arguing against like the biblical history thing, not evolution? Did they somehow get into that, or am I thinking of a different debate?
No, this is actually a different one. This was purely a technical argument, because Fodor can't actually be classified as an anti-evolutionist. He may not think a hell of a lot about what form of evolution he does like, but he isn't really an anti-evolutionist, although the intelligent designers have been really happy to play off of him. Jackson, I put you on the spot about the Hardy-Weinberg and all the other genetic stuff. Maybe you want to weigh in on that one.
Oh, sure. I actually made a series of videos about that.
How convenient. He functions as your lead-in shill.
Yeah. So with natural selection, we can actually falsify it quite easily. If we were to take, I think I made the example, take a polar bear, drop it in the savannah, the open ocean, the tropical rainforest, and Antarctica, or drop a population of polar bears in each of those locations. Which location is the polar bear likely to survive in? You know, if they survived equally well in all those environments, then, well, evidently the environment's not acting on these guys. The environment's not acting on them. The
That's
other animals aren't.
that's not actually an objection to Fodor's argument, because natural selection doesn't that.
You could put.
That's an
Okay, well, we could put what was it, like the crickets in Hawaii, for instance. There was a fly that there was a type of fly that came to Oahu, I think it was, and it preyed upon the crickets by going to them when the males were making their songs to attract the females. And so if
what is the argument? What is Fodor's argument as you understand it? Because it's not clear to me that you do.
I was under the impression that it seemed that natural selection couldn't be tested. If I'm wrong, then I would like to be corrected.
Right. The idea is
what do you understand Fodor's argument to be? Realistic.
Okay, so Fodor's argument is that selection to go with Rosenberg's objection to Fodor's argument, is intentional. And what it means to be intentional is that you can substitute the co-referring terms and not necessarily preserve truth value. So an example is Lois Lane loves Clark Kent, but it's not the case that Lois Lane loves Superman.
And what would be a biological example of that?
Biological example is polar bears were selected for camouflaging into their environment, and it's not the case that polar bears were selected for their whiteness.
Well, why aren't the two identical?
The two are not identical because it's not the case that whiteness means camouflaging into one's environment. You can have, and it's not the case that camouflaging into one's environment means whiteness. You can have, so take for example, you can have white animals that are selected for that don't camouflage into their environment. Presumably, they may have some other, let's just say, coextensive trait that also contributes to reproductive efficiency in virtue of their whiteness.
Isn't the issue of the camouflage and the whiteness being what the animal that it needs to camouflage against? So you need to determine, for example, if the thing you're hunting doesn't have color vision, it doesn't necessarily need to be either white or not exactly white. It only needs to be invisible from its point of view. And so in what respect are you arguing that polar bears are not adaptive based on their color?
This is tangential.
An actual example.
Well, this is tangential in virtue of the fact that I was just between extension and intention. Intention, S, that is, right? So in the one case, it's the content, and in the other case, it's just the. So in Freudian examples, you might say that there's a different sense. So, like if I were to say with the intentional context, I might say that Lois Lane thinks that Superman.
Forget Lois Lane. No Lois Lane. No Lois Lane. No Lois Lane. If you can't give a biological example, you mentioned polar bears. Would you tell me why are you saying that polar bears' coat color is not adaptive? Is that your assertion?
Right. So no, I'm not asserting that at all. And in fact, that's not what Fodor. So I'm asserting that the proposition that the coat was selected for its camouflaging into the environment is intentional, right? And that is not necessarily. What do you mean by
intentional? Is something intended it to be so, or what you use the intention? There's
no intention with an X. So intention with an X with an S, sorry, is the contentfulness of a statement. And so
And
The
what is
reason,
okay,
and this is why
what
I'm
is the
actually skeptical.
contentfulness
I'm
of
actually
that?
skeptical. I'm actually skeptical that you read Fodor's book, given that this is a main feature of the book that he talks about intentionality, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably because it was just as meaningless as in any other case. It's irrelevant to the actual technical. That's the thing that bothered me about Fodor's book. He operates at a completely rarefied
It just doesn't seem like you've
philosophy
understood the
argument,
argument.
rather than, well, if he makes an argument that is like the Lois Lane example or the thumpity thump hearts that don't
Listen,
ground
you
it in
asked me.
physical details.
Do you remember what you asked me initially? You asked me
Do you
my
see an
understanding of Fodor's
example
argument.
of his argument?
Initially you asked me, right? Initially you asked me for my understanding of Fodor's argument, and I was in the middle
Uh-huh.
of explaining it to you when you started rendering
Okay,
objections.
finish the explanation then.
All right. The other instance in which you can have something that's light that provides the requisite intentionality is an instance in which you have counterfactual supporting laws. Natural selection doesn't have counterfactual supporting laws, and so it's in virtue. There's no mindedness there, obviously, unless you're an intelligent design proponent. Then there's no mindedness going on. Mother Nature, as it were, is not selecting for certain traits, and it's also the case that there's not counterfactual supporting laws, because that would be an instance.
What would natural selection? What would a counterfactual supporting law look like? What would be an example of that?
So in ecology E, X trait is beneficial. That's a counterfactual supporting law. So what you can say is that if you were to observe not E, or sorry, if you were to observe not X in E, that would falsify it, right? So the idea is that this trait wouldn't come to fixation in the ecology, given these certain set of conditions, right? Given counterfactual set of conditions. So that's the
And
idea.
in what respect doesn't natural selection do that a lot?
Well, it doesn't do that because you can have the same traits, you can have opposing traits in an ecology. You can have long necks in the same ecology you have short necks in. So you can't say in an ecology this trait will be a beneficial trait.
I see part of the things is you're treating it at a rather higher level. A long neck, it would be relating to a particular animal in its ecological context. That you would have to control for all the relevant variables. Simply looking at that like there's some generic idea. This was the problem that 19th century evolutionists had when they were thinking that animals had a tendency to get bigger. And it turns out, no, they don't. But if you were arguing about whether or not the length of a neck in a particular example is adaptive, it doesn't necessarily need to apply that a similar length of neck may not be adaptive in another context. So it would be natural selection would then predict that there would be affecting that neck length in one environment as opposed to another. So now you have to control for all of those variable conditions, and the scientists do that all the time. That's what was happening with the aphid example.
Listen, you're not grappling with the objection, right? Like, so I offered what natural selection needs to do. It needs to be able to disambiguate the coextensive traits, right? So the one trait you might say is camouflaging. Let's take the polar bear example, right?
Okay.
Polar bear example, the one phenotypic trait is the camouflaging into the environment. The other trait that goes along with that is being white. Now, it's not the case that being white means camouflaging into one's environment, right? You and I both agree that
depends
there are
on
white.
looking at it.
Listen,
selection would suggest that you would need to investigate.
You agree with me that it's not the case that being white means camouflaging into one's environment, right? Presumably, there are white animals that do not camouflage into their environment.
Well,
right?
presumably. Well, let's question whether that is presumably. Are there any white animals that exist that are not camouflaging into their environment? What would be an example of that?
I don't know. Maybe there's not. Let's just take.
Well, you're arguing that there is no obvious connection here, and yet if you can't offer a counterexample, that maybe we can say white animals will be camouflaged in their environment. There are no exceptions. Have you investigated that?
I haven't investigated that. I took it as a matter of fact, but I'm sure a simple Google will rectify this. White animals.
Yeah, I'll look into it as well. So now we're back to what would it take if, for example, we can now identify? Would you need to do experiments where you would be dropping polar bears into non-camouflaged environments or dropping non-whitish? And actually, by the way, polar bears aren't white. They're kind of a off ivory cream. But remember, it's not animal is looking at. It's what a black and white mammal predator, a prey animal, would need to look at. The same reason that cats lions don't need to worry about how they appear, or zebras, environment where the predator goes after them and it doesn't have color vision, so it sees things differently. We have to pay attention to that variable, which the scientists do. Are you arguing that Fodor? Are you arguing that Fodor paid a lot of attention to actual examples in his book?
It's irrelevant whether he did or not, because yeah, it is irrelevant, and I'll explain why it's irrelevant. Because the idea is that what you're supposed to derive from your theory is a priori, right? We derive these, we derive the prediction of gravitational lensing from relativity a priori, right? And then we look into the world and we observe gravitational lensing, and that's how we confirm the theory. The problem is that you can't derive from natural selection a priori that some trait will be contributive to reproductive efficiency in an ecology, right? You can't derive that a priori. The reason you can't derive that a priori is because given an ecology, you might have that trait in one instance where it contributes to reproductive efficiency, and you might have that trait in that same phenotypic trait on another animal that doesn't contribute to reproductive efficiency. Yet they're the same phenotype.
An example of that? An example of that?
Well, you can just say a heart pumps blood, and it also.
Oh, no! Don't go back to that. Don't go back to that same example that you nicked from Fodor. Is it fair to say that when you put that if in there, that you did not first attempt to find out whether or not that if was justified by actual technical literature?
Look, it's just irrelevant, right? Because you might think, like,
oh, if the data is irrelevant, then that's fine.
Right,
but that
I can give you a hypothetical example of why it would be irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether or not it's an empirical example. I can give you a hypothetical reason why it could be. So you can.
You're trying to trump empirical with hypothetical here.
Listen, that's all I need to do to show an error in the theory, because again, you derive the predictions from the theory a priori. You don't derive theory?
Aphid. Take the aphid case. Take the aphid's case. In what respect is that not a verification of natural selection principles?
Listen. I don't understand. I don't know what the aphid's case is. So again, the idea is that if you're arguing that something is selected for, right, presumably there's another coextensive trait that's also correlated with fitness that was not selected for its contribution to reproductive efficiency, right?
Yeah, and when you look at all
do all phenotypic traits contribute to reproductive efficiency?
Depends on the context. No, and yes,
if that's the case, because if that's the case, if all phenotypic traits conduce to reproductive efficiency, then you have an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
No. Now, are you claiming that, well, of course, I can't bring up the aphids case because you didn't study that. Is there any specific example of an actual ecological context phenotypic example that you have studied in depth that makes you confident that Fodor's argument is potent?
Look, I'm already telling you, when you derive predictions, you derive them a priori. Do you understand that?
I don't. Well, that's an interesting question. I think we need to delve into this whole a priori thing that in physics, where you can deal with a different level of thing, because living systems are nonlinear and much more complicated than physics, and so they've always been more difficult to deal with. But you can still make observations, and you have two wonderful examples that you don't have in some of the physics case, because you can look simultaneously at living examples that you can experiment on and look at depth in the genetics and the ecology. And then you also have fossil examples that you can go into as well that can see the track record of what things apparently did in the past, and you can make inferences that way. The main arguments for natural selection, of course, are based on actual living examples. And it sounds like essentially what Fodor did, which was to derive a completely theoretical objection that didn't bother explaining any of the data. And that's what the critics tended to do. I know, for example, that people who would try to get him to discuss.
Fodor's argument is that natural selection doesn't offer an explanation. That's why it's a theoretical objection, right? Because it's saying that there's something fundamentally wrong. It's saying there's something fundamentally wrong. Now, look, biologists make predictions. Biologists are not the theory of natural selection, and I can agree with you that some of the predictions made by biologists do in fact come to fruition, right? Because we have powerful intuitions. The stories that we come up with to explain certain features do have some merit to them, right? But they're not getting any of that. They are not getting any of that from the theory, and they're not getting any of that from the theory because of the problem of intentionality.
Yeah, jump in, Jackson.
I don't want to ask. It's not about the argument. Can we bring in a biologist in the chat?
Is Godless? Is our little pink unicorn?
It's rational mind. Sorry. Can we bring in rational mind?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Drag him onto the turf. I'll just point out while we're waiting for him to join. Did you read Fodor's response to his critics?
Probably.
I went through that in detail because I was curious to see. A lot of it was authority quoting and quibbling over parsing of words and all that. But at one point. Okay, well, I'll continue on with this example because I think it illustrates why I'm not impressed with Fodor. And I was talking with Jackson about this earlier. Fodor on page 14 was railing on, and his co-author as well, about a particular critic who had brought up an example of these jellyfish eyes, and he rather smugly declared about how you couldn't even imagine any reason why these things would be adaptive or natural selection would act on them. They had eyes with retinas, and yet they didn't have any connection to a brain, and therefore they could have served no purpose. And he said, yes, they know the mechanisms of what's going on, but it doesn't lead to any understanding of it. So I looked up what the mechanisms were. And it was clear that Fodor apparently never bothered to look at the actual data. Because as it turned out, yes, there is a nervous system, by the way, in these jellyfish. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't connect that way. But his mistake was in that thinking that these needed to be used for prey hunting. It turns out that they have a very different function, and it has to do with the fact that the crystalline lenses in them function as orientation devices. So it allows the little palps to orient the cellular systems that do act as the hunting. So everything about it was natural, everything about it was explicable, and everything about it was something that Fodor glanced past the data stream without actually bothering to explain it. So the lack of curiosity, the pure theoretical nature of his argument keeps on missing the fact that we have the data. Look, and we're looking at it, and it becomes ever more intelligible.
It's clear that you don't understand you don't even understand what I had just told you, right? What I had just told you is that people make predictions, right? And sometimes people make predictions based on things that are explanatory. They are not deriving those things from the theory, and that is because the theory does not offer I mean, it seems to me like it's trivially true that there aren't biological laws, right? There aren't generalizable counterfactual supporting biological laws. And the reason there are not biological counterfactual supporting laws is because of the fact that we have ecologies where it's not the case that they have A, yet X still occurs, right?
An example
I mean, I can give you an example of, it doesn't matter what ecology, you can say, so like the counterfactual supporting laws is if an organism doesn't have a long neck in this ecology, then it won't exist, right? Now, in that same ecology, like where giraffes are, you find lions. So that's so the counterfactual is false.
What are the genes? Oh, jump in, Jackson.
Okay, so is an objection of this that natural selection can't work in isolation, that it's dependent on environmental variables? Is that an objection to natural selection?
No, the objection is just that you're not deriving your predictions. People mistakenly think that they're deriving their predictions from a theory of natural selection, but that's not the case, right? You have intuitions, like in the instance of a heart pumping blood, right? You have an intuition that the thump noises.
Fodor's example again. Just do heart cells pump automatically before there's even a heart?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
I tell you, they do. And
yes,
so that's another
do.
reason why I'm not terribly impressed with the heart pump thing, because there is a huge literature on the evolution of pulmonary systems and cardiovascular systems in vertebrates and the like.
How is any of that relevant to Fodor's objection?
Well, apparently all of the data set is irrelevant to you.
How is that relevant to Fodor's objection? Yeah, the data is irrelevant because it's an a priori criticism, right?
The data is irrelevant.
I mean,
Fodor is useless because it's like talking about Aristotelian physics as an abstraction rather than looking at how things actually function. A priorism, this rarefied philosophical
what are you talking
thing,
about? How do you derive predictions?
If you can't explain data, it's useless.
What are you talking about? That's exactly what's being charged of natural selection, is that it doesn't explain anything, and it's being charged of natural selection because natural selection doesn't generate ex ante predictions about what organisms will arrive in an ecology.
Actually, it can make some predictions about an organism or an organism's phenotype.
Biologists make predictions. And if you listen to Fodor's lecture, he'll tell you the same thing. He'll say the same thing. Biologists make predictions. And biologists make predictions. Oftentimes, they make correct predictions. But they're not deriving any of that from the theory of natural selection.
Then what are they deriving it from?
Has Fodor done an analysis of the assumption frame of every single natural selection issue that's been brought up in the biological literature? Or rather, has he done that with any of it?
I don't know. I don't understand your question. What Fodor has done.
You are going to claim
what
that
Fodor
biologists
has done,
are making their predictions not based on natural selection. What evidence did he present in an analysis to show that that's in fact the case? When I'm reading the papers about aphids, when I'm reading the papers about the peppered moth, when I'm reading the papers, they are directly applying natural selection principles to their work.
Look, you're just confused, right? What Fodor has shown is that natural selection can't distinguish traits that are selected for in virtue of their contribution to reproductive success and traits that are simply ride-alongs. What's that?
When did he show that? And with what example?
With any example where there's a trait that's coextensive, where there's a phenotypic trait that's coextensive with a phenotypic trait that is contributive to reproductive efficiency. Any example.
Any example? But did he give any example in his book?
I mean, he gave several examples. He gave the heart example. He gave frogs snapping at ambient. He gave
the frog snapping. Did he discuss any of the literature on anurans or hearts?
He gave the example of frogs. He gave the example of frogs snapping at ambient black dots. He gave the example of.
And did he cite technical literature to support that, or was it just a hypothetical example?
What are you talking? Well, you don't need technical literature. The idea is that
yes, you do. If you want to support an argument, you're going to need points that support your argument.
Listen, do you guys understand what an a priori objection is? Because it doesn't seem like you guys understand.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an a priori objection to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. You don't need to know anything. You don't need to know predictions made by quantum mechanics to take that objection seriously, right? That is Schrodinger's cat is an objection to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. That's an a priori objection, right? It's saying that the theory generates true contradictions. So
am I allowed to do an a priori objection that says that Fodor's a priori objection is invalid?
yeah, in fact, that's what you're called to do, right? You're called to give an analysis, an a priori analysis of how you can generate specific predictions from natural selection alone.
Now, let us distinguish between two forms of objection. An a priori objection that Fodor is wrong versus an objective observational objection that Fodor offers no evidence for his position and explains no actual evidence.
It's not an explanatory hypothesis. So there couldn't be evidence for Fodor's objection.
Can there be an explanatory hypothesis in your frame? Do you allow that one can exist?
Yeah, there are plenty of explanatory hypotheses.
So give an example of one then.
General relativity is.
No. In
biology, I don't know.
No, you don't know. Did you ever think about it?
No, I mean, I don't know.
So I would contend that you do not imagine the possibility that there is in fact a biological system that is not running off of this a priori thing, and because you don't bump into the data.
What do you mean running off of a priori thing? It's a criticism of theories. It's just a criticism of theory.
But isn't the theory grounded on
it's not making any claims about the it's not making any claims. Fodor is not making any claims about the world.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah,
he's making claims about theories, right? So look, if I were to theorize that the universe and everything in it, including the space, were all expanding at a uniform rate, you could object to that by saying that's an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
Is it unfalsifiable?
Yeah, it's unfalsifiable. You can derive from the meaning of the words that hypothesis is unfalsifiable. Of course, there are unfalsifiable.
Is anything in science falsifiable to you?
Yeah, I just gave you an example of something that was falsifiable. It's the theory of general relativity.
How would you falsify general relativity?
What's that?
How would you falsify general relativity?
By observing something moving through space faster than the speed of light.
Mm-hmm. And how would you go about observing that?
I don't know.
So if you can devise no technique whereby you might do that, then it isn't general relativity unfalsifiable because you cannot develop an instrumentality to do so?
No.
Why not?
Because the falsifiability isn't about a mechanical limit. It's an in principle. It's an in principle limit. So if I could come up with the instrumentation to measure that.
And you're claiming so are you claiming that natural selection is in principle unfalsifiable?
Yeah, that's what I'm claiming.
And so there's no amount of analysis if you can't even imagine. But the point is, I can imagine things that would refute natural selection. If a positive trait that has no countervailing effects is not being sustained in a population, or contrarily, that a deleterious trait that you can objectively observe is in fact sustained in a population without any countervailing trait, those would all refute natural selection, wouldn't they?
I mean, I don't even know what it means to say that a deleterious trait. It's like you're committed to a contradiction. Then it's like you're committed to a contradiction. It's like let me finish what I'm about to say. It's like what you're saying there. If those species tend to reproduce, it doesn't make any sense to call them deleterious traits, right? So what you're saying is a contradiction. You're just uttering a contradiction. You're saying a contradiction.
There are no deleterious traits at all.
No, I'm sure there are deleterious traits, right? They just can't come to.
Sickle-cell is not a deleterious trait.
They just can't come to fixation in a population.
Why not?
Right, because they don't contribute to reproductive efficiency.
Okay, so now if you find that sickle cell is sustained in the population, why is that so? Natural selection would say that there must be
presumably because there are other traits that do contribute to reproductive efficiency.
Right.
Right.
So it's been selected for positively because in that environment, it is the case. Now, why is sickle cell found in certain populations and natural selection predicts where that's the case?
Natural selection doesn't predict anything. That's what I'm
Oh,
contending.
yes, it does. If you have a malaria incidence, you will have sickle cell being maintained in the population. It's happened 3 times independently in the human genome. We don't have to guess at it. We can measure it.
Look, but you're not, that's fine. You're not deriving it from the theory of natural selection, right? And that's because
What do you mean?
I gave
just
you
did.
the options. I gave you the options, right? So when there's a trait, there might be a trait that has a causal link. When I say it's contributive to reproductive efficiency, I'm saying there's a causal link between the phenotypic trait and reproductive efficiency, right? And there are also traits that that come along with that do not play a causal role in contribution to reproductive efficiency.
You're not reaching a core area. Are you claiming that the people who say they're using natural selection to guide their research aren't actually using natural selection to guide their research?
Yeah, I would probably claim that they're probably mistaken because natural selection.
Have you examined any
unfalsifiable.
Instances of that to identify this alleged lack of connection between natural selection and their?
Well, look, if they have an answer to Fodor's argument, then you're welcome to provide
Forget
it.
Fodor. Forget Fodor. It's you. What we want to know what you have investigated. Fodor makes an assertion, which is fine and dandy, that natural selection is never used by anybody, I guess, to derive actual conclusions. Now, I can see in the sickle cell case and in the bulimid rotifers and in the aphid case and sexual reproduction, all of this, they're using natural selection directly to predict why certain things are occurring and not, and they are successfully able to anticipate the ecological context based upon that. Now, am I just hallucinating that they're using natural selection?
Yeah, how are they doing that if they don't have counterfactual supporting biological laws or mentality that suffices?
You use that counterfactual supporting laws. Explain what you mean by that in a concrete sense, because it's just jargon to me. What does it mean in the concrete sense?
The counterfactual notion of causation is that if X didn't occur, Y wouldn't occur.
Okay, how would that apply in the aphid case, for example?
I don't know. Again, there are probably
or in any
notions
biological case.
Like
how have you applied that to a biological case?
Listen, Fodor believes that there are things that are selected for. He just doesn't think that natural selection does any theoretical work.
Give of that.
It doesn't. I mean, if he gives any specific example, it doesn't matter. He believes, for example, hearts were selected. He believes that hearts were selected for their contribution to reproductive efficiency, for example. He believes that hearts were selected because they pump blood, right? He believes that.
Oh, but heart develops before the blood system. Just as a matter of factual material, Fodor didn't actually delve into any of the paleontology or genetics or developmental biology of heart evolution, did he?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, he didn't. That's one of the reasons why I was so unimpressed with Fodor's book.
They were primitive myocytes before there were blood systems in animals. In like the Ermetazoan is, or not, maybe they're not the Ermetazoan, but some ancestral metazoans of the like what is
none
it?
None of that. That's all irrelevant. I mean, everything you're saying.
That's what we were just talking about.
You keep on saying all the data is irrelevant. Are you willing to stipulate that Fodor's argument is absolutely theoretical and can explain absolutely nothing about any empirical evidence in the real world or make any predictions on its own?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Fodor is not offering.
And I'm supposed to pretend.
Fodor is not offering. Fodor is not offering. Fodor is not offering an explanatory hypothesis. Right? Fodor is not generating predictions. Fodor is critiquing a hypothesis for being unscientific. He's saying the hypothesis is unscientific in virtue of the fact that it can't generate novel predictive expectations. And it can't generate novel predictive expectations because it can't provide the intentional context which it needs to provide in order to generate specific predictions. So when you ask the question, why does trait T come to come to fixation in population? When you ask that
Yeah,
question,
what would be an example of a trait T?
what's that?
What would be an example of a trait T that he used in his analysis?
I mean, one of the traits, we've gone over several of the traits that he uses in his example.
No, he's given generic conceptual things, heart, heart, thumpy, thump, frog jumping, and so forth. At no point did he ever ground that. If you're talking about a trait, you are talking about a genotype. You are talking about cis-regulatory systems. You're talking about very specific details.
No, you're just
talking about ecological
you're not talking about the
Fodor
genotype.
never
You're
gets to
actually
that.
only talking about phenotypes. We're only talking about phenotypic traits.
But it's not the 19th century
That's
anymore.
presumably
We're
what
in the
natural
21st
selection acts
century,
upon. Presumably natural selection acts upon phenotypic traits, right?
which are based on the genetics and the
I
developmental
don't see how
biology.
that's. I don't see how that's
All of that.
how's that relevant?
That's why your argument doesn't get any traction, and neither does Fodor, because you're never bumping into data. And so the people who actually are doing the work and bumping into the data, who are using natural selection constantly and predictively, just go, what the hell are you talking about? And that's why Fodor is...
They're
In
not
what
using.
respect does
They're
Fodor's
not
argument
using
differ?
natural selection, and the reason they're not using natural selection is because natural selection is unfalsifiable for the reasons I listed. None of which you've contested. None of which you've contested.
No, excuse me. I have contested exactly. I have maintained exactly the opposite.
Which part of Fodor's argument have you contested?
Claim that the biological community is not directly applying natural selection in their discussions. They're using it.
That's not part of Fodor's argument. That's a conclusion of Fodor's argument. So which part of Fodor's argument are you criticizing?
But you just said that Fodor is claiming that they aren't using natural
Right,
selection.
that's a conclusion. Right, that's the conclusion of Fodor's argument.
In what respect
So
is
which
this
part of Fodor's argument are you actually criticizing? Which premise in Fodor's argument are you denying?
That he's claiming that they're not using natural selection predictively.
That's the conclusion of Fodor's argument.
What do you mean? But what is the premise that allows him to have that conclusion?
The premise that allows him to have that conclusion is that selection for is intentional.
Intentionally, again, you need to explain more clearly. I'm not understanding this intentional thing. Are you claiming that there has to be an intender?
Listen, if you say that, like, let's just take what you said right there. You said you don't understand what intentional means. And if Fodor's argument relies on that, how could you understand Fodor's argument then? How could you know that Fodor's argument is false?
Because I don't think he understands what it means. Explain what
listen,
it means.
Okay, so then now you have another burden of proof. If you think Fodor does not understand what it means to be intentional, then you have to explain what it means for something to be intentional, and then explain how Fodor has gotten that wrong, that analysis wrong. Now I happen to know that. Now you're asking me a question, but look, I don't want you to ask me that question because I explained intentionality earlier. I don't want you to ask me that. I want you to now recognize. I still don't know what your explanation was. Now I want you to recognize. I want you to recognize that you don't understand Fodor's argument because you don't know what intentionality is. You admitted that yourself.
Explain in a sentence.
No, I'm not going to explain. I'm not going to explain.
Argument.
I'm not going to explain anything, and I'm not going to explain anything because of what you've conceded, right? Because you've already conceded. You have conceded. Listen, you have conceded that you do not know what intentionality is, right?
Because he doesn't know what intentionality is. If you cannot explain it to me,
well,
you don't know.
Hold on a sec. Hold on a sec. That's a ridiculous thing to say. You don't know what intentionality is because he doesn't know what intentionality is, as if there's some sort of causal.
I know what intentionality means with I intend to go and get some potato chips. That's an intention. Now, what does it mean in a biological context?
That's the wrong.
Then explain
it
the
means
difference.
The same thing. It means the same thing in the philosophical context that it means in the biological context.
Then there is no intention in biology at all.
It means that you can't substitute the co-referring terms and preserve the truth value. That's what it means.
What is that? I don't know what that means. Explain what that means. That's jargon.
It is jargon. So it means I've given you examples. If I were to say Lois Lane thinks that Clark Kent can't beat up Superman,
Back to Lois Lane. Use a biological example.
Look, I don't understand why you're making that. I don't understand why you're making that stipulation.
Meaningless.
Listen,
Because he's
why are you
talking
making
philosophy and you are talking biology, James. That's the thing. I don't know if you realize this, but you guys are both.
Between Fodor and his side and the regular scientists, that they're operating.
Listen, I don't understand. Let's just get this clear. I just want to get this clear. I just want to make sure that this is clear, right? You do not understand Fodor's argument based on your admission, right? Because you admitted that you don't know. You had to ask me a question. What does intentionality mean? You had to ask me a question. That means that you don't understand Fodor's argument. It follows from that you can't assess whether or not Fodor's argument is a good argument because you don't understand the argument.
No, let me offer an analogy of my own. Is that I do not understand flood geology's notions about kinds because they don't understand flood geology's notions about kinds. And that's the fundamental point. Yes, he's using terminology. Yes, he's using logical analysis. Yes, he's using things in relation to Lois Lane and generics. But if he doesn't ground it in specific examples, it has zero meaning in biology. That's what I'm saying, where I don't understand what he means in relation to biology.
Well, you can give any it doesn't matter, any real world example, any real world example, period, is going to be susceptible to a Fodorian objection. And the reason it's going to be susceptible to a Fodorian objection is in virtue of the fact that every trait that contributes to reproductive efficiency also has right-along traits, right? It's coextensive with things that that are not themselves contributive to reproductive efficiency, right? And they're not and that seems to be trivially true unless you want to say that all traits that exist contribute to reproductive efficiency.
Okay,
which is patently false. Which is patently false.
Whoa. Are you claiming that it is not possible to understand all the various traits involved and ascertain what contributory role they are playing in generating a particular phenotype and also its reproductive success?
Sorry, I didn't listen to what you said. Say it again.
Are you claiming that it is impossible in principle to understand all the contributing factors in the phenotype that generate reproductive success and evaluate them?
No, I'm not claiming
Okay,
that.
then to what extent have modern evolutionists managed to do most of that?
I don't understand the question, but what I am claiming, I'll tell you what I am claiming, that there are a slew of traits that do contribute to reproductive efficiency, and each of those traits has an infinite number of coextensive traits, coextensive phenotypic traits.
For example, please, what is an example?
I mean, I can give any specific one. Right. So polar bears being white and camouflaging into their environment is one example.
And you've already, you have studied nothing about polar bears, have you, in terms of their genetics or their ecology?
It's not relevant. They have two phenotypic traits.
Well, then why did? No, it is relevant. If you are going to, you can't simultaneously. Although you've been trying.
It's not relevant.
You can't
simultaneously say there are an infinite examples. It's not relevant because we all know the phenotypic trait that contributes to reproductive efficiency is the camouflaging into the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all know that, right?
It will be different depending on the organism.
Do we not know that? Do we not? I'm sorry, you didn't answer my question. Do we not know that? Do we know that the trait that contributes to reproductive efficiency in that instance is camouflaging into its environment? Do we know that or not?
We do.
Right now, that is coextensive with being white, because being white does not mean camouflaging into one's environment. It might always be coextensive with camouflaging into one's environment, but it doesn't mean camouflaging into one's environment. Right? We agree that being white doesn't mean camouflaging into one's environment. I can walk outside with a white shirt on, and it doesn't mean that I'm camouflaging into my environment.
Right. Are you saying that it doesn't matter to the polar bear in its environment?
This doesn't mean anything. It's just an effect, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding you, but it's just an effect of being in that environment. It doesn't anything beyond that, unless I'm misunderstanding you.
Look, okay, Jackson, what's Fodor's argument as you understand it?
I already told you. I I mean, as you could see earlier, I wasn't understanding what the argument was, but I'm just telling you
So
as of right now. No, hold on. I'm just telling you as of right now, based on what you said in that moment. I was just responding to that. I wasn't responding to the argument as a whole. That's just what I was just.
Right.
I think Fodor's argument is basically that natural selection cannot distinguish between the two traits that are coextensive, right?
it
Basically.
can't distinguish which trait is selected for.
But
And that's
natural-
because ex ante natural selection doesn't generate specific predictive expectations from because there aren't law-like relations between phenotypic traits and ecologies.
Right. But what I'm saying
law-like would it need to get for you?
But natural
is there like a threshold lawism?
Counterfactual
What's the
supporting.
cutoff line?
Counterfactual supporting.
Can you measure that counterfactual
Can
level?
somebody just dumb it down without all the jargon? Like, can just what the argument is? Maybe give an example.
Yeah, I've tried to give examples, and it's hard to get examples.
It's pretty
out
simple,
of the
but
opponent.
I think the issue is that natural selection doesn't choose between two coextensive traits. I mean, it's basically the same thing as hitchhiking, right?
Yeah.
Nobody claimed that natural selection can choose between two coextensive traits. So I mean,
well,
I think
if it can't do that, right, then it doesn't explain why the phenotype exists, because that's what it's.
Oh no,
that's
that's a conclusion, John, because axon is the whole organism. That was part of the problem with
Look, if
Richard
it doesn't
Dawkins'
generate a
selfish.
prediction.
Wait, whoa! Let me at least finish my sentence, please. That was the problem with Richard Dawkins' selfish gene approach to things, because genes aren't selected for, even though elements of them can be selfish in the whole organism. But so what biology has to pay attention to is the entire organism in its ecological context, which they do, and they use natural selection predictively and analytically to lead to new knowledge. And it strikes me that if Fodor is coming in ex cathedra announcing, oh gosh, because of his intentionality and all sorts of notions that he has as theoreticals, that they aren't doing what they're doing down on the work floor is ridiculous. They're doing the work, and Fodor is irrelevant to this.
Look, you can come up with any post hoc rationalization for your view you want. That is not going to be relevant to the fact that natural selection doesn't have any counterfactual supporting laws, in virtue of which you could generate specific predictive expectations given an ecology. Because it's not the case that given an ecology, this phenotype is conducive to reproductive efficiency in all cases, and that's because in the same ecologies, you have different phenotypic expressions. That's why. So if it doesn't generate the prediction that X trait is going to be beneficial in this ecology, then it can't explain it, because what explanation requires is predictive capacities of that kind.
So what natural
selection
predicts is that the individual or basically the individual in the population with the highest fitness, not the trait, the individual in the population with the highest fitness will pass on its genes more often than the other individuals, and will ultimately it'll result in a higher frequency of that individual's set of alleles, basically. So I think that's a mistake.
That's what Fodor takes. That's what Fodor takes to be a truism.
That's
right?
Fine if you want to call it a truism.
How do you apply
well, if it's a
realistic...
truism, then it's also not doing any explanatory work, right? Because when we understand contribution to reproductive efficiency, we understand that in the statistical notion of which you're speaking.
Realistic, how would you apply that to Richard Lenski's experimental work with bacteria over years, where they're applying natural selection principles?
I don't know anything about Lenski's work, so I can't comment.
Biology that you've ever studied?
Well, can I ask one question? Is this argument, John? Is your argument more about the predictive nature of natural selection, that we can't make specific predictions?
Yeah, it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain why traits come to fixation in a population, because it doesn't predict that any particular trait will come to fixation in an ecology. That's why. So it doesn't explain the phenotypic variations.
But I think you're confusing the mechanism of evolution, of natural selection, with the prediction, because the mechanism is just differential reproductive success, right? So that's the mechanism, right? And then the prediction is just that over time the frequencies will change based upon reproductive success. That's all it is.
Well, I consider it, if you want to analogize this to, let's say, meteorology, where you would still have this, it seems like you'd have the same issue. You couldn't predict
example.
you couldn't make a specific prediction about there's going to be X amount of hurricanes, or that there would even be one hurricane of this particular magnitude.
Or that it will rain on your driveway at a particular time of day. Absolutely impossible. And therefore meteorology is useless?
Yeah, it doesn't, because obviously we can model in the long term to say, well, it may get hotter over time, or this year because of the El Nino effect may produce different results, but there's no specific prediction that can be made. But meteorology is a science, and that's kind of how natural selection works. Even though you can't say this organism is going to turn out this way, but there is this aspect to it where it doesn't work.
If it doesn't predict the phenomenon, then it doesn't explain it. That's it.
We can't.
But in that paradigm, meteorology would also not be a science. It would also be defeated by this same argument.
Look, I take natural selection to be the way Charles Darwin understood it, as a contrastive example against artificial selection. Now, in artificial selection, you have mentality. Mentality is inherently intentional, right? So when I say something like the counterfactuals that are supported is like, if you take the Arctic fox example, the counterfactuals that are being supported is what's being selected for is how docile the foxes are. Now, whether that comes coextensive, listen, I'm not finished. Whether that comes coextensive with their fur coat length is going to be irrelevant, because their fur coat length is not what's being selected for, right? So you can say, you can support the counterfactual in virtue of the intentional nature of mentality, that if X were not to occur, Y would still occur, and that's because what's being selected for in virtue of the mentality is a particular trait, docileness, as an example, right?
But I'm sorry to slow things down, but it seems to me that what you're putting forth would defeat natural selection. I agree, but the consequence of that, it would also defeat meteorology, and it seems like you don't want to accept that fact, because both of these sciences don't have no. So I'm asking you. Let me just real quick. Let me just explain what's going on there.
I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that you're correct. If I assume, for the sake of argument, that you're correct, then that's just an argument from consequence, right? Which is a fallacious argument. So it's irrelevant that might apply to meteorology if I assume that what you're saying is true for the sake of argument. Which I don't. So many things are
irrelevant to you. Really amazing. The goal. Let's
do you know why? Do you understand why I'm saying they're irrelevant?
Here. Is it the purpose of science? Do you understand why I'm saying they're irrelevant? Well, yes, I do understand, and I think it's a stupid argument. Let me ask a question.
But you believe that? Listen, but you already conceded. But you already conceded that you don't understand the argument, right?
It's my show. I get to ask a question now. Would you agree that it is the object of science to explain the data?
Yes.
Is there any sense whatsoever in which Fodor explains any data?
No.
Then he is not doing science. He's doing a philosophical jiu-jitsu game. That's fine.
I agree that Fodor is not doing. I agree that Fodor is not doing science. How is that relevant?
Because we're talking that the science works, and if and when Fodor wants to apply his arguments in such a way to actual science data and show that
you don't even understand Fodor's argument.
Doing.
Right, you've conceded as much. You don't even know
No,
what intentionality is, so you've conceded that you don't even understand Fodor's argument. And how could you criticize an argument that you don't understand? That's what I want to know. How could you criticize an argument that you don't understand?
You're trying to understand.
You guys are talking over each other because one person is talking philosophy and the other person is talking science.
This is still my show here. Let me point out, let me toss out this proposition. Fodor's line of reasoning is no more nor no less presuppositional than Ken Ham's creationism.
What are you talking about? It's a conceptual objection to a theory that purports to be scientific.
And so does Ken Ham's presuppositionalism.
That's the same type of objections. Listen, but you don't say that when someone used Schrodinger's cat to argue against the Copenhagen interpretation, you didn't say, oh, you're being like religious like Ken Ham, right? That's not the response there. When other people give different interpretations of something like quantum mechanical systems, you're not saying that they're being religious when they're giving criticisms of why those couldn't be the case, because in all those interpretations of quantum mechanics, they generate the same predictive expectations, right? Some of them are, some of the interpretations are incoherent, and so thus are rendered false by philosophical analysis, because, like I said, they're incoherent. So
which parts of quantum theory have been rendered false?
Well, I mean,
we're using devices that use integrated circuits that are based on solid state physics, that are based on quantum physics. I'm not saying that there aren't true propositions in quantum physics. I'm saying that there are propositions in quantum physics that you know of.
I think that there's an interpretation of the Copenhagen interpretation such that it has to be necessarily false, and that's because it commits one to a contradiction.
It change any of the observable data?
No, it doesn't change any of the empirical data. That's why it's a conceptual. That's why it's a conceptual objection.
Conceptual and irrelevant. Fodor's argument is charmingly amusing, but irrelevant.
I don't understand how you're saying that it's irrelevant simply in virtue of the fact that it's conceptual, right? Criticizing a scientific theory for being unfalsifiable is not empirical. It's not the case that something is empirically unfalsifiable. It's the case that something is conceptually unfalsifiable.
And I contend that it is indeed conceptually falsifiable. It is empirically falsifiable and hasn't been empirically falsifiable.
But you haven't.
That's why we're confident in it.
But you haven't supported that, right? And I gave an argument to show that it's not.
I offered specific data and repeatedly attempted to ground you in specific data, at which point you invariably say that's irrelevant.
Yeah, that's because it is irrelevant. It's a conceptual objection.
So the conceptual objection is, like Ken Ham's, a presuppositional one that is independent of the data, can never be falsified by the data.
Presuppositional. It assumes, look, if you watch Jerry Fodor's lecture, when you watch him explain it, he takes things to be true that are generally true, or generally he calls them untendentious notions in biology. So if you want to say that's presuppositional, to take to be true untendentious notions in biology, then by all means go ahead and say that. But I don't understand what kind of fucking objection that is.
So could I say something?
Jump in.
I just wanted to say the idea that you can't make predictions with this is pretty much false, because if you take an introductory evolution course, right, you can make the calculations based upon the fitness of the individuals to figure out what the
it doesn't explain what it's supposed to. What it was supposed to explain is why a certain phenotypic trait comes to fixation in a population. Now, if you're making a different claim, then Fodor's argument doesn't address that. Right? But in the case of artificial selection, you can appeal to mentality to explain why a certain trait came to fixation in a population, in an ecology, in any ecology, in fact, because as long as the participants are capable of bringing about that phenotypic trait, then that phenotypic trait is the trait that you would expect. And so the counterfactual goes, right?
Let me jump in with a footnote here.
Let me finish what I'm saying. Let me finish what I'm saying to Achiwawa. So the counterfactual goes, if you didn't have this mental phenomenon, then you wouldn't, in fact, expect the trait that came to fixation in the population.
Well,
right? But natural selection doesn't have anything like that.
Before you jump in, let me just put in my footnote.
Go ahead.
Is it not the case that Fodor, although he says, and you use the phrase phenotypic feature, that's fine, that at no point did Fodor ground that in an actual genetic or biological example? Is that correct?
We've been over this. Every single, as long as you accept a few premises, which is that not every phenotypic trait that an organism bears is one that is conducive to reproductive success. As long as you accept that.
Prove it. If the data doesn't matter, how does that not affect your argument?
I'm asking you a question. I'm asking you a question now, right? The question is, does every single trait in ecology conduce to reproductive success?
No.
Okay, so then you agree with me. Fine. Now that we're on the same page, that's all that Fodor needs.
Does every phenotypic trait have a fixed effect on reproduction?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure.
And the answer is no, it doesn't.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was going to assume the answer was no.
On its context, and if you don't pay attention to that context, which, by the way, the natural selection people do pay attention to the context, then you are using an abstraction that you are leaving out one of your variables.
Listen, all I'm saying is that from the theory, because you don't have law-like relations between phenotypes and ecologies, given that in some ecologies, some phenotypes come to fixation.
And what would a law-like thing look like? Force equals MA, what would it look like?
Right, that's a law-like relation.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a counterfactual.
Do you believe biological systems are linear or non-linear in nature?
I don't have a belief about that. I don't understand what you mean.
Oh, well, I'll clue you in on it. Biological systems like weather systems, that brings up the meteorology again, are non-linear systems. They are too complex to do simple mathematical relationships. This does not mean they are not totally metaphysical and mechanistic and intelligible in many details. And so what natural selection has done is...
None of those are things I've claimed.
But those are things you have to think about if you go beyond the abstraction of Fodor to how it's to be applied in an actual context.
So how long have we been doing this thing? Have I been in here about an hour?
We're at 6:11 here. If you have to rush off, that's fine. We're actually past our hour thing, but I didn't want to pull a plug on it because we were getting some interesting questions and interactions from the peanut gallery, and I always enjoy that. Well, I guess we should pull this up, and then we will want to maybe do an after show to do postmortem discussions. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for listening for our show. And hope we'll get further discussions in the next evolution hours in future. Thank you so much, and we are shutting down now at 6:12.